Good evening. I'm Meg Crahan, the director of the Cuba program at Columbia University and the webinar series Cuba and Beyond, which obviously this evening is including Peru. On behalf of Columbia University, the Institute of Latin American Studies, and the Cuba program, we want to welcome all of the members of the audience and urge them to put any questions they have in the Q&A room. We will gather them together at the end of the three presentations, and there will be hopefully ample time for our three speakers to respond to them. We are also announcing a time change. Our November 4th update on U.S.-Cuban cooperation on environmental issues will start at 5 o'clock and run from 5 to 7 instead of our normal time from 6 to 8. I will now introduce our three speakers in the order in which they are going to speak. Our first speaker will be Cynthia Mcclintock, who is a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. She holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard and her PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She has published a great deal, but for our discussion this evening, perhaps her most important work is her book on the implications for democracy of runoff versus plurality rules in Latin America, particularly in terms of elections of presidents. She has a number of other books, including the United States and Peru Cooperation at a Cost. Following Professor McClintock, we will hear from Marie Burt, who is an associate professor of political science and Latin American studies at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in Virginia. She has a very interesting book entitled Silencing Civil Society, Political Violence and the Authoritarian State in Peru, as well as several other books that she co-authored and co-edited relating primarily to politics in Peru as well as in the Andes more generally. She has become a well-known witness in court cases concerning truth and reconciliation, as well as human rights abuses. And she is a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, which is well known for its work on human rights. Our third speaker will be Martha Pro Santana, who is joining us from Lima, Peru. She is the directora del Centro para el Desarrollo Urbano y Rural in Peru. She has worked for over 28 years, primarily on the organization and the setting up of programs that monitor the socioeconomic status of women and children. Martha will be speaking in Spanish. At the end of the three presentations, there will be time for questions. Any questions you have concerning any of the three presentations, please put them in your chat room. We will gather them up and send them to the respective speaker. Thank you for your attendance here this evening, and we will begin with Professor Cynthia Mcclintock.
Thank you so much, Meg. Thanks to Columbia University for this invitation. And let me see if I can get my my screen up. Hmm. Hmm. Oh, whoops, I think I see maybe what it's, sorry. I haven't done this for a while. Hmm.
There should be a green button where you can, at the bottom, it should say share screen.
Yeah, that's what I'm hitting. But and then I'm going to desktop, allow Zoom to share my screen, and go to share. Open system preference as well. Let's see.
Cynthia,
Mhm.
why don't you summarize?
Yeah, okay, great. I'm sorry, I would have liked to have done that. I hadn't had, I haven't had that problem before. These different computers, these different things. I am known as an optimist about Peru, and up until a couple of weeks ago, I would have had to have been a pessimist. But I'm feeling in a much better about the future prospects after the Castillo's naming of a new cabinet. So I entitled this presentation, Peru Back from the Precipice, with a question mark, because it's been a really, really difficult 2-3 years in Peru. The first two slides were about Peru's successes from 2000 to 2016. I think that's a really important context to keep in mind. Again, this is where Cynthia Mcclintock as the optimist comes in. Essentially, from 2000 to 2016, regular elections, free and fair elections, legitimate elections, tremendous advances with media openness, a fact that just it seems absolutely amazing in the United States is that an investigative journalist, Gustavo Gorriti, was named the 6th most powerful person in the country. This is a very fervent, very committed, very active journalist, and to have that kind of power, I think it's a testimony to the openness of the media in a lot of in Peru. Also, economic success from 2000 to 2016, Peru's economic growth rate was the best in all of South America, second best in Latin America after Panama. Its Gini coefficient, poverty rate, both were improving, like 3rd or 4th most in Latin America. So there was a lot of growth, but with inclusion during that period, 2000 to 2016. But then 2016, we begin to head into problems. First, the election is centrist was surging, Julio Guzman, and he was disqualified just very, very close to the first round. And the first round winners, Keiko Fujimori and Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. Pedro Pablo Kuczynski hailed from the far right. It's now pretty clear that he was also behind bribing electoral commission people to disqualify Guzman. I think it was very unlikely that he would have prevailed as someone hailing quite from the right, but again, a complicated election. The left, Veronica Mendoza, was for very good reason terrified of a victory by Keiko Fujimori, and supported PPK, enabling him to be elected. But it's a very, very narrow win, so that's a problem. And it's also a problem that Keiko was vengeful. And, I'm not going to be too nice to Keiko in this talk. I don't think Joe Marie's going to help me either. For some reason, I don't think so. Not going to be too nice. Very vengeful opposition, obstructionist. Again, these are center-rightists. There was no reason to be so obstructionist. It wasn't like there were huge policy differences, but very, very confrontational, difficult. Finally, then another big problem is the corruption scandal. The Odebrecht corruption scandal breaks open. Now, this is as a result of the plea bargain in the United States. But, Pedro Pablo Kaczynski is implicated. His impeachment in March 2018 comes about in good part because he's trying to kind of cover this up and get around it somehow. And ultimately, thinking lots of things happen, but ultimately March 2018, he's impeached, and the second vice president, Martin Vizcarra, succeeds him. Vizcarra looks at PPK's problems with the Fujimoristas, it's known the Fujimorista party, and decides, I'm not going to go that route. I'm not going to try to be nice. I am going to get out there and fight. I am going to be, just as aggressive as they are. And that was sort of what he did. And Peruvians liked it a lot. Needless to say, the legislature was not so happy. And so essentially from March 2018 into November 2019, there's a lot of conflict between the executive and the legislature. And again, Vizcarra is kind of trying to exploit this, but nothing too much good is getting done for Peru during this period. And then kind of in a surprise, in November 2019, Vizcarra is impeached. And 2020, Vizcarra is impeached, and this gives rise to a sense of what just happened. The country wasn't really thinking this was going to happen. Vizcarra remained very popular, and again, he was confronting a legislature that had lost any kind of legitimacy, and the interim president named by the Congress, Manuel Merino, was perceived as a political hack, and this is where you get 3 presidents in the course of 1 week. In late 2020, very strong protests. Youth go out to protest, and middle classes go out to protest. The concern is democracy, and ultimately Merino resigns, and to everyone's surprise, it was very, unexpected, but a legislator from a centrist party called the Partido Morado emerges as president, Francisco Sagasti. And he proceeds from November 2020 to be the interim president. And by virtually all accounts, did a good job during this period that he was president. But it's a really, really tough period because obviously in March 2020, the pandemic has hit Peru just tragic. I'm sure most of the people in our audience know that by the official figures of Johns Hopkins University, that the per capita fatality rate in Peru is the worst in Latin America. It is I think it's 600 per 1,000 people, whereas the next worst is Brazil at 280 or something like that, and the US is a little bit over 200. These are all as of September. So it was a horrific death toll. When I was in Peru in August, it was what everybody was talking about. My uncle died, my grandfather died, the neighbors there, everyone in the family was infected. It was just an incredibly tragic situation. It's not clear to me that Peru is really that much worse than so many other Latin American countries. But my own sense, there was a commission that went to Peru and kind of doubled their figures overnight after looking at deaths that were not being counted. So it's very possible that if other countries had correct figures, their numbers would be a lot higher. And we can't really count on Brazil to be doing a good job with its numbers, right? So, but what is clear is that this was a terrible toll. And so we go into the 2021 elections in a very difficult situation. There's storm clouds everywhere. People are, they're distracted by the pandemic. The big concern is the pandemic. At the same time, and again, this toll of the pandemic, it was about triple the number of fatalities in something like a year and a half as occurred under the 10 years of Sendero Luminoso, to put this in context. no, triple year and a half versus 10 years. A horrific, horrific death toll. And the economy, of course, this was not because Peru didn't try with a lockdown. They tried with a lockdown, but for lots of reasons we can't talk about here, that failed. But in the midst of all of that, the economic decline was the second worst in Latin America after Venezuela during this period. So it was just a terrible period. So we head into the 2021 election with basically a preoccupied public, a public that's looking at this corruption scandal. And I forgot to mention in February 2021, this is only a couple of months before the election, Vacuna Gate breaks open, where again the public had been looking at Martin Vizcarra and still believing that he was honest, and all of a sudden it's revealed that actually he was getting his own vaccine on the side, and all of the the deals with Sinopharm were not transparent, and he is now tarnished. So many politicians tarnished by corruption. So the quote traditional political class, which has always been looked at askance, in Peru, people looking towards outsiders. This is magnified many times over as we head into 2021. So it's a very, very difficult election. And I spoke with some people when I was in Peru in August who said, well, really, they should have postponed it. The only candidate who actually got out to campaign was Castillo. A couple of the candidates got COVID, delaying their campaign. So the candidates couldn't campaign. The pollsters, who in Peru generally do a poor job, did an absolutely terrible job. Obviously, they were not getting out to the countryside at all. So the pollsters totally failed to see the support for Castillo until it was a couple of days before the election, which might well have altered the outcome. So the pollsters couldn't poll, and people couldn't talk to each other. And sometimes I think this was the most important. I mean, other elections, it wasn't that in 2021 in the first round, there was suddenly a lot more candidates than usual. Peru was notorious for 16 candidates, 18 candidates, 20 candidates in the first round. But usually people can talk and say, okay, this is a good guy. Let's go for him. We'll come around together around him. And that didn't happen because people couldn't talk with each other. So there's a wonderful slide, which unfortunately I can't show that, it's a cartoon of, on the left, the 19% of the vote in the first round for Castillo, the 13% of the vote for Keiko. Keiko's on the right, Castillo's on the left, and in the middle is this statue. We don't care about this, and 40% abstention, or let's not do this, or we don't like it. No answer, right? So this was not a good first round. There's something, obviously, Meg referred to my book about runoff. Runoff is supposed to help with this problem. And I think runoff did provide, ultimately a legitimacy for Castillo that he would not that it's a great legitimacy, but it's more than if he'd only won that 19% in the first round. So it did help in that respect. But on the other hand, obviously, Castillo was at the far left. Keiko Fujimori, a tremendous but between 2016 and 2021, her support, her approval has plummeted, because of the evidence of corruption that Gustavo Gorditi in particular was able to muster. And so her support had really decimated, during that period. So these were two candidates who were far, in my view, from the Condorcet winner. In other words, they were far from the candidate who, if they were paired with every other candidate, would have won. But the problem was that kind of all the candidates who you could place more or less at the center divided the vote among them. So if you added up all the sort of more or less 9 of the 18 sort of centrist candidates, they would have gotten 40%, which is more than the left or the right, but it was all splintered. So runoff, no election rule can really solve a problem if you've got these 18 candidates all fragmented vote. Who might have been the Condorcet winner? I think possibly Johnny Lescano, the Acción Popular candidate, who finished fifth, I believe. He was the first of the, he just defeated Veronica Mendoza, who might also possibly have been a Condorcet winner. She was the candidate for what's now called in Peru and I'll use the term because everybody in Peru uses it, so it's helpful, the caviar left. And there was another candidate, two more on the center right, George Forsyth. Both Forsyth and Lezcano had led the polls at one time or another, but both had different problems that I won't go into here. But I think that would have paled if they had been against Castillo or Fujimori, you know, in a runoff. Ditto Veronica. But I might leave it to Joe Marie to talk a little bit more about the differences between the quote caviar left and Castillo, or perhaps not. But in any case, Castillo was the plurality winner with 19%, and Keiko with about 13%. And there is it's important to mention here because it's important to know with respect to Castillo that the right was strong in this election. I was frankly rather shocked. A candidate who everybody in Peru calls Porky managed to get some 11–12% of the vote. Hernando de Soto was another candidate on the right, just behind Keiko. So there were three strong candidates, on the right. So again, it went Castillo, Keiko, de Soto, Porky before we get to Lezcano. So, there is some 1/3 or so of the vote in the Congress that has a pretty far right there. So we need to keep that in mind in terms of Castillo's governance. This is not sort of a lot of centrists that he's dealing with. But in any case, a runoff is held between Keiko and Castillo, and it becomes very very sad in many ways. Keiko makes all kinds of challenges, a smear campaign. There was the word to smear as a terrorist, to sort of charge anyone even without evidence as a terrorist became a verb, teruquear. It was Peru's going to become Venezuela tomorrow. And very, very polarizing. Castillo tried hard to moderate. I think his essential support in the first round had been his base in the teachers union. My own sense is that this was his, he had led a teachers strike back in 2017 and was pretty well known to folks in the Highlands in particular for his leadership of that strike. And given that none of the other candidates were catching fire, my guess is that a lot of the teachers in remote highlands areas in particular said, hey, Castillo's a good guy, vote for Castillo. And that this helped him a lot with base in indigenous communities. Know that teachers are respected folks. And if the teacher says, hey, vote for Castillo, and you don't have another candidate you're gonna like, that helped. But for the runoff, people are obviously, again, he comes from nowhere. And for the runoff, everyone is questioning, who is Castillo? Who is this guy? And the big question was Castillo's relationship with Vladimir Cerrón. And Cerrón was the founder and leader of Castillo's party, Peru Libre. And Cerrón would have been the candidate for Peru Libre, but he had been convicted of corruption when he was the head governor of Huancayo and could not run. So Castillo became the candidate even after the platform of the party was written. And of course, everybody is asking, what does Castillo really stand for? How does he relate to Cerrón? Now, one point to keep in mind here is that when Cerrón chose Castillo as the candidate, or when the two of them chose each other as the candidate, nobody in a million years thought Castillo was going to win. So it wasn't that important a decision because no one thought he had a chance in the world to win the election. So they just need a candidate, right? But again, coming back to the point about journalists, this is not a good environment for an election because I talked to one journalist. Why didn't you go to Chota from Cajamarca? Castillo hails from Cajamarca, northern province of Peru. Why don't you go there and talk to people and find out? I mean, he was once a member of Peru Posible. What did this mean, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, what? in the middle of COVID, we're going to take an airplane and then we're going to get in a colectivo and then we're going to go, walk to this community. What? Are you crazy? Of course we couldn't do that. So there was sort of a lack of information, and it's not really clear what the relationship is between Castillo and Cerrón. But if I had the PowerPoint, maybe Joe Marie will. Castillo, he would like to be on his Palomino horse, and he had the symbol of the pencil. And the more of the ethnic overtones of Keiko's campaign alienated voters in the highlands, the more I think Peruvians said, hey, Castillo is our guy. Now, again, there's a lot of arrogance that seeps through her discourse, and this kind of accusing everybody as a terrorist, accusing people of being ignorant. All of this led to, ultimately, in the runoff, the narrowest of victories. This was less than half a percentage point that Castillo ultimately won by. But he pulled it out. I think a lot because of these factors that people in the highlands, in particular, with the exception of Junín, the province where Cerrón comes from, they were not so keen on this. They don't like Cerrón particularly. But in a lot of the southern highlands, Castillo got more than 80% of the vote. Lima, by contrast, was a bastion for Keiko with some 65% of the vote in Lima. So this distinction between the provinces in Lima is important, not just because of the historical cleavages in Peru, but also because the legislature in Peru does include quite a lot of legislators from the provinces. But in any case, I see I've got like 3 more minutes or 5 more minutes, Meg? Something like that. 5? No. So 4, okay. So it's a very, very narrow victory for Castillo. And then to make matters worse, in terms of kind of cleavages in the country and tensions within the country, Keiko charges fraud for weeks and weeks. And it's not until a week before the actual inauguration date that Castillo is declared president-elect. And again, a continuation of her kind of smear campaign allegations, obviously taking a card from the Trump playbook. But ultimately, the election monitors, everyone is basically in agreement that narrow as it was, Castillo won. So again, Castillo had been promising through a lot of this time that he would govern as a moderate. But he has about a week to name his first cabinet. And when he's inaugurated, he names a cabinet that really worries a lot of people, including me. Guido Bellido, who was the first prime minister, a pretty far left Peru Libre, congressperson, pretty close to Cerrón. So, and then just, there were the foreign minister, this was while I was there, Hector Behar, making pronouncements that, I was amazed, frankly, that the U.S. embassy kind of kept its cool amidst many of the things that were being said, at the time. But I was shortening the story a lot here. But obviously, we have a Congress where Castillo, with the caviar left combined, is about a third of the vote. So, he's got to think about the possibilities of impeachment. He's got to think about votes of no confidence. He's got to think about the perception of his relationship with Cerrón. And when Bellido comes out and says, hey, let's think seriously about expropriating a major gas concession called Camisea, this goes against what Castillo has been saying. And he decides, this is back in October 6th, to fire Bellido and name a new cabinet, and Joe Marie will talk more about this. The new prime minister is a woman, which is one of the things too I haven't mentioned is Cerrón. This is what I termed an unreconstructed left. Cerrón was educated in Cuba, and his views seem to come from kind of 1960s Cuba. There was one cartoon, the machista Leninista ideology. The first cabinet included fewer, I'm sure Marta will talk about this, included fewer women than any cabinet in a decade or more. So there were a lot of concerns about and this had long been a division between, quote, the caviars and the Cerrone, left views about women, views about gay people, other kind of these kinds of civil liberties, issues. But it's a woman who's the head of the new cabinet, retaining Franke, retaining Velarde, and a solid team. So I'm a lot more optimistic now that there's going to be a capacity for governance. There's a lot of good things happening. Mineral prices are very high. So this gives the government some revenue to do things like, the Lima media, of course, is very opposed to Castillo. So they're getting support from the media in the provinces, radios, quite a few new programs beginning that will increase support, especially in those areas. And again, the legislature is a very divided legislature. Remember, this is a right. Keiko is, she's really, I would say, kind of ancient history at this point, and De Soto and Porky, and these are not people who are getting along with each other all that well. And there are a lot of legislators from the provinces in Acción Popular, in Acuña's party, who mostly want to kind of get along, so I think there's a potential there for governance, which I know I was worried about a couple of weeks ago. And the vaccination program has been moving ahead, so that's all good news. The economic growth for this year is expected to be around about 9% above the Latin American average, so that's good news. So there's a lot of good news in the last month or so that I hope means that Peru has moved back from the precipice that I feared it was at, a month or so ago. So
Thank you very much, Cynthia.
I'll work, but
Jo Marie Burt.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Columbia and Elas, for organizing this. It's great to be here with Cynthia and Martha. So I'm a little disconcerted because I'm usually the optimist on panels like this. And so I'm actually not as optimistic as Cynthia for reasons that I think will become clear as I move forward with my presentation. But I'm actually very encouraged to hear of Cynthia's optimism, and I appreciate your wonderful overview of the past 20 years, which you set the stage for the extreme instability that we've seen in Peru over the last few years. Despite all the positive things, I think is really quite remarkable and requires further explanation. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of where things are, kind of building a little bit on what Cynthia's already said. And then I'm going to try to just kind of highlight 3 ideas that I think help us try to understand where we are. Though I think, again, further theorizing and explaining needs to be done to help us understand where we are today. So as Cynthia has noted, the 2021 elections in Peru were marked by very high levels of polarization and baseless claims of fraud put forth by Keiko Fujimori and her allies. Ultimately, we know Pedro Castillo was recognized as the victor and inaugurated as president on July 28th, 2021. Castillo promised big political, economic, and social changes, including a constituent assembly to rewrite and replace the 1993 Constitution. However, he faces severe challenges from within and from without. On the one hand, I'm going to talk about the without first. On the one hand, Castillo lacks a majority in Congress. His Peru Libre party has only 37 seats in the 130-member Congress, which, as Cynthia has mentioned, is dominated by conservative opposition parties that, while they are divided, are viscerally united in their hostility to the Castillo administration. And I think it's important to keep in mind how precarious this is in a country in which presidents can be impeached essentially without cause because of the extremely vague wording of the 1993 Constitution, as demonstrated just a year ago when President Vizcarra was removed from office, which Cynthia has already referred to. And I'm going to come back to this idea because a new law was just passed that upsets a bit this bizarre balance of power in Peru, tilting things in favor of the Congress and against the president, which makes this even more complicated. But in fact, I'm afraid that the biggest challenge facing the Pedro Castillo government might be not the hard right parties in Congress who have vowed to see him removed from office even before he was inaugurated president, but the very party that brought him to office, Peru Libre, and his own weak leadership style. As Cynthia's mentioned, Peru Libre is led by Vladimir Cerrón, a former governor of Junín, and who was convicted of corruption a few years ago, which, as Cynthia mentioned, made it impossible for him to run as presidential candidate himself in 2021, and led him to invite Castillo to run on the Peru Libre ticket. Again, as Cynthia said, not because he supported Castillo or even believed he would win the presidency, but as a way to raise the profile of the party and presumably his own chances for a future presidential bid. Since Castillo's inauguration, the last 100 days or so, Cerrón has acted as if he is the true power behind the throne, imposing members of the cabinet, trying to assert his leadership over a series of policy issues, mostly from his Twitter account, even as Castillo has shied away from exercising his own power as the elected president in Peru. And this tension came to a head earlier this month, as Cynthia's noted, when Castillo announced a shakeup of his cabinet, removing, most importantly, Prime Minister Guido Bellido, who was a Cerrón loyalist, and replacing him with Mirta Vázquez of the more moderate Frente Amplio. I have a great deal of confidence in Mirta Vázquez. I know her personally. She was a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, working in Cajamarca, which is where President Castillo is from. She worked with the NGO Grufides, which was founded by Marco Arana, and who later founded Frente Amplio, of which Mirta Vázquez is a member. She's well known for her defense of environmental rights and indigenous people's rights. She led, huge cases against powerful mining companies, including Newmont, in the north of Peru. And as sort of an accidental Speaker of Congress last year, she was elected to Congress in that snap election in 2000. She became a member of Congress and quite accidentally became interim Speaker in November of 2020, and proved to be quite an effective leader. So I think that Mirta Vázquez, as the head of the cabinet, does offer some real hope. However, Cerrón immediately vilified her as Cynthia mentioned, the caviar left, a term that the far right in Peru uses to denigrate the progressive left. It's very jarring, in my opinion, to hear someone from the left pejoratively refer to someone else from a more moderate left, but the left nonetheless, with that term in a negative way. And he said that Peru Libre would not give its vote of confidence to her cabinet because it represented a shift to the center right. So we have a problem here in terms of how Peru Libre is dealing with this shifting. The Cerrón loyalist Bellido is removed, replaced by someone that Cerrón views as, in fact, I think he openly called her he referred to two members of the cabinet who are members of Peru Libre, Betsy Chavez and Dina Boluarte, who's also the vice president, as traitors for remaining in Castillo's cabinet. It's very jarring to hear Cerrón talking about the president and the president's cabinet of his own party in these terms. And so it's like there's like a little civil war happening amongst Peru Libre and the people supporting Castillo, and it's unclear to me if this is going to be papered over and they're all going to kiss and make up, or if it's going to explode. There's talk about Castillo's follower, the Peru Libre faction in Congress. They have 37 members of Congress, and about half are allied with Castillo, and about half are allied with Cerrón. Castillo needs these guys. He only has 37 members of in Congress to begin with, and there's a real the right-wing parties in Congress have been talking about removing him, impeaching him from the get-go. They currently don't have the numbers, but if Cerrón really does somehow decide that it's in his interest to move to the opposition, and remove Castillo in his fantasy that he would then be replacing him. I don't know where this is going to lead the country. So if Castillo is unable to keep his party together, he's going to face, obviously, a very difficult time governing, as these right-wing parties in Congress are circling around him like vultures, awaiting an opportunity to impeach him. And here's where that recent law that was just passed comes in. Congress passed a law overruling a presidential veto of that very law that limits the president's ability to censure the Congress. In the 1993 Constitution, after the president has carried out 2 censures of the Congress, he can dissolve the Congress and convene snap elections. The law does not at the same time limit the Congress's ability to impeach the president using that very vague moral incapacity clause. This gives Congress huge leverage and undermines the position of the executive. A lot of people have called this unconstitutional. They call it a serious imbalance in the equilibrium between the executive and legislative branches in Peru. And so this leads me to be a little bit more, if not outright pessimistic, at least very concerned about how things are going to play out given this scenario. I do think that, Mirta Vázquez gave her presentation before Congress when she was seeking her approval from the Congress for her cabinet. And she focused on bread and butter issues. She focused on the need to address the pandemic. She focused on education, getting kids back in schools, which is very important, as we know from here as well, from the United States as well. She talked about jobs and the economy. She said, we're not really focusing right now on a constituent assembly, which, for the Cerrón faction is a problem. They want a constituent assembly and they want it now. And so, I think for some members of Congress, her bread and butter focus is appealing and might get her she only needs a simple majority to get her cabinet through. So she might be able to do that, but then we still have this equilibrium that I'm talking about. So now I'm going to switch a little from the day-to-day nitty-gritty of the last 100 days and talk about just a few ideas that I've been kind of kicking around to help us understand what's going on in Peru. And the first idea I want to discuss is polarization. The 3 ideas are polarization, improvisation, and fragmentation. And I just love the way that those sound, right? Polarization, the idea here is that the polarizing dynamic of the elections, driven in part by what Cynthia's written about in her book, the second round dynamic, which, as Cynthia was saying, had the elections taken place a month before, a month after, the 2 candidates who made it to the second round might not have been Keiko Fujimori or Pedro Castillo. It might have been 2 more centrist candidates. And so the polarizing dynamic that we're seeing now, we might not be seeing that. However, because these were the 2 candidates, the far right candidate and the far left candidate, as a result, the period between the first and the second round vote was extremely polarized. And because the right has grasped onto this concept of election fraud and refuses to let it go, and they continue to engage in this, what Cynthia referred to the terruqueo, the constant red baiting of Castillo and many members of his cabinet and his government, this dynamic of polarization is continuing and ongoing and really creates a very unstable dynamic. And I think, one of the members of Congress for the right, I think her Luciana Tudela, her father was the prime minister under Alberto Fujimori, has said that the mere fact that Castillo named Bellido as his prime minister is sufficient cause to impeach him. She said this just a couple of days ago. She's been saying it for the last 100 days. So the right is not giving up on its idea that it needs to remove Castillo from the presidency. Linked to this dynamic of polarization, I think it's important to also note the presence of the emergence of far-right hate groups, La Resistencia and other movements that are emerging, organizing intimidation campaigns, engaging in targeted attacks. During the elections process, they focused their attacks on elections officials, trying to intimidate them into declaring fraud. They even would set up protests outside the homes of the head of the Jurado Nacional de Elecciones and the OMPE in an effort to intimidate and pressure them. And they've also, the prosecutor in the Fujimori, the Keiko Fujimori case, Jose Domingo Perez, has also been the focus of their attacks. And post-election, Castillo's inauguration, there have also been attacks against other figures perceived to be either allied with or too condescending towards the current government, including former Supreme State Prosecutor Avelino Guillen, who was the person who brought charges against and achieved a conviction of Alberto Fujimori for crimes against humanity. Independent journalist Jaime Chincha has also been the object of their attack. So this virulent, very right-wing groups on the street, organizing protests, mobilizing, attacking in supermarkets and outside people's houses is a fairly new thing, and a reflection of this polarizing logic, I think. The second thing I want to talk about is this idea of improvisation, which I'm thinking about changing to incompetence, but I haven't quite gotten there yet. But this focuses on the way the Castillo government itself has been handling itself in its first 100 days of being in office. There's a profound lack of coherence and factionalism within Peru Libre and in the Castillo government that is really damaging its ability to govern the country. And I think that contributes to fueling this polarizing logic. I think it gives encouragement to the right that they can get away with this because the government is perceived as so weak. And so it's improvising so much. It's important, I think, to remember that Castillo came to power promising pretty big changes. He promised political change. He promised a new constitution. He promised economic change, changes in the neoliberal model that many people see as not responding to the needs of the majority, especially in the context of the pandemic, which Cynthia has already discussed at length. And cultural change, I think, especially in terms of addressing the problem of racial discrimination and the dominance of Lima-based elites in the way the country is run. But so far, what we see is just utter improvisation, weak leadership, lack of direction in fighting, in coherence, and that's where I'm leading towards maybe even just outright incompetence. From the very beginning, you saw the improvised nature of the government. I mean, when Castillo was naming his cabinet, he literally did not have all of his cabinet members, and then there was protest by some members of the cabinet over other cabinet picks because they were seen as either not being qualified for the job or being, in the case of Bellido, literally being openly homophobic and misogynistic. So there was a great deal of turmoil in just the first couple of days of his presidency. There were some procedural missteps, which meant that Peru Libre, although they're the majority party in Congress, they don't have an absolute majority, but they're the biggest caucus in the Congress. They weren't able to obtain congressional leadership because of a simple procedural misstep. So now the right wing has control of the Congress. So there you can see a little bit of how this improvisation is undermining the Castillo government. There's also some real questions about Castillo's leadership style. This is 100 days into his government, and this is a man who's never been elected to public office. So clearly he is a neophyte. So you've got to give him maybe perhaps a little bit of room, but 100 days into it, he still seems uncomfortable in his shoes as president. He kind of still acts like he's in campaign mode, right? He's not a leading or forceful presence. And this is evident in his inability to address this problem of factionalism within Peru Libre itself. And you see this, there's been battles between Castillo and Cerrón. There were instances when Castillo was literally seen as Cerrón was seen as telling Castillo what to do. And Castillo just sort of taking it. which I think undermined his credibility. There are many instances in which Castillo was in direct conflict with his prime minister, Bellido, again, a Cerrón loyalist. And those choques, those clashes came to a crescendo in September. For example, Bellido said that Peru Libre was going to nationalize Camisea Gas, and the president had to, say no, we're not going to do that, because the economic consequences of that would be huge. Although I heard that just yesterday, he said that he is going to nationalize Camisea Gas. So again, this is like even more confusing because there's a lot of flip-flopping going around, right? Bellido said that when the Congress was calling to interpolating Minister of Labor Iber Maravi, Bellido said that the president would call a vote of confidence against the Congress if it did that. And Castillo said, no, I'm not going to do that. So there's this kind of back and forth between Castillo and Bellido. Oh, and then there was these WhatsApp messages that were released showing that, Bellido was, texting other members of Peru Libre, literally undermining all these different positions of the Castillo administration. So it was no surprise when in early October, Castillo announces this shakeup of the cabinet, removing Bellido and 6 others, and really distancing himself from Peru Libre. So, and again, as I mentioned earlier, this earned the immediate wrath of Cerrón, and he literally said, this is ridiculous. Peru Libre deserved its quota of power. And many people noted the great cynicism that turn of phrase entailed. It's not that Cerrón and Castillo differ all that much in terms of their orientation and in terms of policy making, in terms of things they wanted. There's perhaps degrees of emphasis, but it's really about quotas of power, not about policies and the direction of this government. So I find that to be very disconcerting and something that Castillo has not proven terribly adept at addressing. And so that has me worried. The last idea I want to just briefly mention in my few minutes left is fragmentation. There is extreme political fragmentation in Peru, both in terms of political identities and in the political party system. This was seen in the 2021 elections. There were 18 political candidates. Despite that fact, most Peruvians were preferring to vote for nobody rather than any one of those 18 candidates. And as Cynthia noted, the 2 top winning candidates, neither of them pulled over 20% in the first round election. In a recent IEP poll, half of the country could not name a leader of the opposition, which is kind of stunning, right? It's very stunning to me. So I think that you see this extreme fragmentation also in the Congress, right? There are 10 political parties represented right now in the Peruvian Congress. If Peru Libre splits, as people are talking about, that will be 11. And so you have, it's currently sort of evenly divided amongst the far left, the far right, and then these parties in the middle, not so much because they're centrist parties, but because they're not really ideological, they're more pragmatic, and they're willing to negotiate their votes in exchange for favors. And sometimes those favors might lead to corrupt dealings, I think. And a lot of those folks, a lot of those parties are the same parties that voted to remove Vizcarra and backed the Merino government. So that also has me a little bit worried. I don't really have time to get into the detail about those different parties and how this is playing out in the Congress, but I'd be happy to elaborate further in Q&A. Let me just close by saying that I think that Peru, there's a sensation in Peru that the political and economic model that has governed Peru since the 1990s is exhausted. It doesn't work. The political system is one of the things, perhaps the main thing, driving political polarization, and that has led to this systematic cycles of instability and fragmentation. And this is resulting in the inability to build consensus for governance. And so my fear is that rather than Castillo being able to, to get this cabinet to really move forward and stabilize the situation, I think it's possible that we might continue to see ongoing cycles of changeover, instability, and perhaps another attempt to remove the president of Peru. And I think, again, COVID's not over. People are still getting sick. Hospitals are still very much overflowing in Peru. And so in terms of sort of what this means for everyday Peruvians, the result of this is terrible. The result of this polarization, this fragmentation, this hyper ideological red baiting that the right continues to use as a way to keep itself relevant is really troubling. Neither Cynthia or I really mentioned the problem of the media in our presentations, but in like the 1 second I have left, I think it's important to note that the media, though Cynthia's point about an open and very vibrant media ecosystem in Peru in general terms, in this election, what we saw was mainstream media literally joining the right-wing bandwagon and not really, I mean, it was as if all the open source television stations in Peru were Fox News, and there was no balance whatsoever. Luckily in Peru, there are a lot of digital media engaging in very good investigative journalism, and that has allowed for there to be, I think, information flowing through to Peruvians in general, but the mainstream media has been essentially co-opted. And I don't know, it's not like in the 90s when the Fujimori government literally paid the media to do their bidding. Now they're doing their bidding because there's a confluence of interest between the right-wing elites that own the mainstream media and the Keiko Fujimoris of Peru. And I'll end there, and thank you for this very kind invitation to be with you tonight.
Thank you, Jo Marie. We'll now move to Martha Pro Santana, who will speak in Spanish, and she will focus on the impact of the developments in Peru have had on women. Martha Pro.
Ok, gracias. Buenas tardes. Quien les habla, soy la directora del Centro para el Desarrollo Urbano y Rural. Agradezco la invitación del programa Bellón del Instituto de Estudios Latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Columbia. El Centro para el Desarrollo Urbano y Rural se formó en el 96, en 1996, y mi participación en este evento es porque quiero dar a conocer nuestra experiencia local acá en Perú, sobre todo en los distritos que venimos trabajando, como es Villa El Salvador, como es Pachacamá, Manchay, Lurín, sobre todo cómo esto ha afectado, porque nosotros estamos muy abocadas, siempre ha sido de que se inició, ha sido el trabajo dirigido desde un enfoque de género y desde el tema de los derechos humanos, ¿no? Trabajando con las mujeres, con las y los jóvenes, ¿no? En primer lugar, nosotros hemos venido, como todos los países, siendo azotados por la pandemia, teniendo un escenario de crisis permanente por la COVID-19. Esto marcó una situación de crisis permanente en el país. ¿Y por qué? Por el impacto de las pérdidas de vida, porque llegamos al final de 2020 con más de 140.000 fallecidos, y otra cosa también fue el colapso del sistema de salud para atender a más de 1 millón de personas contagiadas, ¿no? En paralelo se desató una crisis laboral que sobrepasó incluso en importancia a la que vivió en el plano político, porque ya lo habían explicado bien las compañeras, tuvimos 3 presidentes sucesivos en el transcurso de una semana, en noviembre del 2020, ¿no? Hubieron olas de protesta de ciudadanas donde mujeres y jóvenes salieron a las calles en noviembre, donde un grupo, porque nosotros sí les llamamos, son un grupo de usurpadores, que tomaron el poder, ¿no? La presidencia, y que después de 6 días tuvieron que renunciar, ¿no? Teniendo como cabecilla a Merino de Lama. Estas protestas fueron protagonizadas, ¿no? Por una multitud de jóvenes que, desafiando la pandemia, porque era en plena pandemia, salieron a manifestarse por la democracia. El resultado es que tuvimos 2 jóvenes que fallecieron, Inti Sotelo y Brian Pintado, ¿no? Murieron por disparos de las fuerzas policiales, y que este grupo fue el que dieron la orden para que se les rebasara con todos los jóvenes y mujeres que salieron a las calles. Bueno, luego vino la designación del presidente Sagasti. Él convocó a la jurista feminista Violeta Bermúdez, ¿no? Para ponerse al frente de la presidencia del Consejo de Ministros y Ministras. En el Congreso estaba asumiendo la presidencia legislativa la señora también feminista Mirta Vázquez, que en la actualidad ella está como premier del gabinete del actual presidente Castillo, quien está ayudando muchísimo, porque en un momento las mujeres sentimos que el tema de género se nos iba por el desagüe, el tema xenofóbico apareció tremendamente, no había claridad en eso, se le exigía también mucho a Verónica Mendoza, ya que estaba en una alianza con Castillo, a que esas cosas no se perdieran, porque son luchas que han hecho las mujeres y no podemos retroceder en eso. Pero bueno, ahora está ahí tratando ahora de que se apruebe hoy día entre hoy y mañana, el gabinete actual del presidente Castillo. Vamos a ver qué resultado vamos a tener, ¿no? A la fecha. Pero lo más importante es que en ese momento del 2020 también se reconoció a las feministas como la defensora de la democracia. Más allá de esta presencia en las calles, en las redes sociales, quedó evidenciada la participación juvenil, ¿no? En las movilizaciones ciudadanas, y que además eso se había convertido en un nuevo y potente poder de convocatoria. Entre mujeres y jóvenes, ya sabemos que en este país cualquier cosa que se quieran atrever a hacer, vamos a tener que salir a las calles, ¿no? Después también se visibilizó con la crisis, definitivamente, se desnudó esa situación, esa inútil apuesta por la economía de mercado, la debilidad del Estado peruano, ¿no? Y una fragilidad en cuanto al empleo, porque ya que teníamos 3 millones de personas que perdieron empleo, y hasta un 82% de las trabajadoras, ¿no? No pudieron regresar a sus labores en plena, afectadas por la cuarentena, ¿no? La gran mayoría fueron mujeres trabajadoras informales, ¿no? Adicionalmente a eso, hay que sumarle el 500.000 de microempresarias, ¿no? Que se habían quedado sin el autoempleo, porque ellas mismas se habían generado una microempresa. El otro tema también importante fue la virtualidad, ¿no? Que llegó con la pandemia para quedarse, pero que también es importante porque las plataformas digitales están marcando nuevos escenarios, pero también trajo dificultades para la gran mayoría de las mujeres, ¿no? Una por las brechas digitales, ¿no? Traducidas en barreras de conectividad, el acceso a equipos apropiados, también las posibilidades, ¿no? O la disponibilidad de planes de datos para poder entrar. No todo el mundo tiene computadora, no todo el mundo tiene acceso e ingreso para poder tener, ¿no? Un plan que le permita estar, ¿no? Conectada permanentemente. Y lógicamente el confinamiento también, pudimos ver que por la emergencia sanitaria no significó una disminución en el nivel de la violencia, ¿no? Por el contrario, se aumentaron los niveles de violencia y feminicidio. CEDUR en sus programas institucionales, como nosotros trabajamos el tema de derechos de capacidades, trabajamos el tema de salud holística y lo que es incidencia y gobernabilidad. Tuvimos dificultades para desarrollar las metas, ¿no? Programadas que nos planteamos entre el 19 y el 21, 3 años, porque esos son los fondos que teníamos. Sin embargo, en el 2020, con dificultades y superando algunos problemas, continuamos las acciones del Programa de Desarrollo de Capacidades, ¿no? Y también tuvimos que hacer ayuda humanitaria porque esa era la emergencia, la urgencia. Y así implementamos, por ejemplo, locales comunales con materiales prefabricados para que se puedan realizar las ollas comunes al final ya de la cuarentena. El apoyo sí en la cuarentena con la virtualidad. Entonces logramos aglutinar a grupos de mujeres por ubicación de viviendas aledañas, ¿no? Otorgándole la conectividad, ¿no? Y así pudimos desarrollar talleres, ¿no? De afirmación, de manejo de las emociones. Durante la cuarentena, las mujeres, nosotros teníamos un programa que venimos desarrollando hace más de 10 años, que es la formación de terapeutas, como en el tema holístico, ¿no? Estas mujeres formadas como terapeutas por CEBDUR en la Escuela de Artes de Terapia Holística, desarrollan también programas que tienen que ver con toda la parte emocional, ¿no? Y psíquica de las mujeres. Así nos permitió en estas zonas donde trabajamos, porque hay en cada uno de estos distritos, tanto en Villa El Salvador, en Lurín, en Pachacamá, Manchay, ¿no? Grupos de mujeres formadas por la escuela para atender los casos de estrés, de depresión, ¿no? Tanto las víctimas de violencia y de abandono, porque en la cuarentena muchos hombres ya no llegaron a los hogares y se desatendieron de las mujeres, y otros fueron que dentro del hogar hacían violencia, y cuando terminó la cuarentena se mandaron mudar y se quedaron las mujeres como jefas de hogar, ¿no? Entonces, atender a estas mujeres víctimas de violencia a través de terapias, con acupuntura, con reiki, con ejercicios de qigong para la respiración, ¿no? Para el control también de las emociones. Había que tratar mucho porque hay muchas cosas que se juntaron, ¿no? Talleres en salud sexual reproductiva, ¿no? Tratamos de darles y en nutrición para una alimentación más sana que contribuya a elevar un poco el sistema inmunológico, pero además con bajo costo. Uno de los logros interesantes que vimos fue que nosotros teníamos un programa años anteriores de implementación de huertos familiares en cada una de estas zonas, y eso ayudó muchísimo porque nosotros logramos, ¿no? A través de las organizaciones de la DRF y de este grupo de mujeres formadas, que a las mujeres les pudiéramos alcanzar canastas con productos alimenticios, pero también que complementara esto de los huertos, ¿no? Entonces eso fue una cosa interesante de además de seguir impulsando, ¿no? También para tener la autoalimentación, que en estos momentos de crisis fue crucial, y que en algunos grupos que nosotros ya habíamos trabajado les ayudó muchísimo, ¿no? Entonces, también ubicamos que los niveles de violencia que se dieron también fue por el hacinamiento del espacio familiar. Ese es uno de los temas, porque las casas muy pequeñas, muy precarias, con mucha familia adentro, ¿no? Porque vive la abuela, la tía, la hermana, los hijos, el marido, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? La desprotección también por la desactivación de los servicios públicos de atención a la violencia, ese era otro tema. Se desactivaron también algunos centros de emergencia de mujer, o sea, eso era también a dónde reclaman, a dónde, y se sumó en la de los servicios de las fuerzas policiales, porque si alguien te pegaba, tú ibas a la comisaría, no venía el policía, no te atendía. ¿Por qué? Porque estaban más concentrados en el cumplimiento de el aislamiento social y los toques de queda que teníamos, ¿no? Entonces, lo más grave es que muchas mujeres perdieron la vida, se evidenciaron algo que ya se había señalado y veníamos trabajando hace tiempo, que en la mayoría de los casos de violencia contra las mujeres, el agresor tiene vínculos con la víctima y a veces se ubica en el hogar, ¿no? Muchas veces en el ámbito familiar. Entonces, durante estos 100 días de cuarentena se registraron, por ejemplo, en los distritos que yo les he mencionado, 12 feminicidios, ¿no? Entonces, en estos, eso es, así es fuerte, ¿no? Y también en todo el año, según el registro, en base al ámbito familiar, las publicaciones de ONGs, ¿no? Y los que lleva Flora Tristán y Manuela Ramos, hubieron 138 feminicidios, cerca de 400 agresiones sexuales a niñas, desaparecieron como 500 mujeres, porque hay un tema de trata también tremendo, ¿no? Y lo único que funcionaba era la línea 100, que hubieran 40.000 llamadas durante el tema nada más de pandemia. Y sin embargo, eso pues desbordó y no se podía dar una asesoría ni una atención desde el Ministerio de la Mujer, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, ahí nosotros pues nos planteamos definitivamente en esta experiencia comenzar a actuar lo más rápido posible, ¿no? En cuanto a que, por un lado, trabajar el tema mental de las mujeres, ¿no? Afirmándolas, ¿no? Y el otro era el tema urgente, que era de tratar de desarrollar todo lo que se pueda a nivel de ayuda humanitaria, ¿no? El tema, por ejemplo, de nosotros llevar las canastas, llevar de limpieza, ¿no? Porque era urgente, ¿no? Los kits de limpieza, las canastas familiares y la implementación de estos espacios para que las ollas comunes funcionen y eso pueda ser una ayuda entre ellas, ya que no se generaban ingresos, ¿no? El otro tema también era el tema de atención de salud a las gestantes, ¿no? En salud reproductiva. ¿Por qué? Porque las gestantes no se atendían adecuadamente y además muchas tuvieron a la hora de dar a luz problemas, complicaciones, porque estaban más concentrados en la pandemia y no se abastecían también para la atención de las gestantes, ¿no? Entonces hubo también una deficiente distribución de los métodos anticonceptivos, la píldora del día siguiente. Por ejemplo, los kits de emergencia, el MINSA reportó haber entregado 970 entre enero y noviembre, frente a los 11.000 que se demandaban, ¿no? Entonces, en estos distritos, ¿no? Donde que les mencionaba como Villa El Salvador, Pachacamama, Anchay, Lurín, hemos tenido mucha dificultad nosotros para poder trabajar y apoyar con estos grupos de mujeres, pero tratamos de organizarlas, ¿no? En la medida posible en los barrios, por hogares aledaños, a trabajar con las lideresas vecinales, con las organizaciones locales ahí, ¿no? Por barrio, por manzana, y con esto de las promotoras de salud y las promotoras formadas por CEPDUR, tratar de llegar lo más que se pueda también con los fondos que se tenían, ¿no? De lo que se trata es de darles una atención, nosotros nos decíamos, lo más integral, y sobre todo el tema de salud mental, que era muy, muy fuerte, ¿no? Y, por ejemplo, las promotoras de salud, ellas entraban a atender casos de salud mental y física, ¿no? De manera natural, recogiendo que la ancestralidad de la medicina tradicional china y también la medicina andina, a través de las hierbas, de una serie de cosas que manejamos acá, ¿no? Entonces, esto también sentimos que fue una gran ayuda porque se sentían un poco más tranquilas, habían temas de afirmación, temas sobre la muerte, porque muchos de los hogares tenían también un familiar fallecido, y hasta a veces 2 o 3, cómo trabajar eso, cómo entender lo que se estaba viviendo, esto de la no planificación, la inseguridad, ¿no? Porque el confinamiento y el hacinamiento de estos espacios trajo pues muchos problemas con la pareja y también con la relación de los hijos, ¿no? Y también se dieron, por supuesto, violaciones con adolescentes mujeres y a veces incluso, ¿no? Llegando a embarazos también, ¿no? Entonces, la situación permanente de inseguridad que afectó a las mujeres, ellas pues vivían una situación mental no saludable, ¿no? Y que no solo por la cuarentena de no salir, sino también de tener al maltratador dentro del hogar, el no poder denunciar incluso los casos de violencia debido a las escasas posibilidades de acudir a un albergue o la intervención policial, ¿no? también el miedo al contagio, lógicamente, la desesperanza de haber perdido lo que ellas habían generado, ¿no? La desesperación por no contar con productos de alimentación, entonces había que tratar de ahí atender lo que más se pueda, ¿no? Y bueno, en ese momento el Estado, tanto Vizcarra, que era que estaba ahí, y Sagasti, tratar de dar los bonos, ¿no? Pero que no llegaban tampoco a todos a cubrir, ¿no? Entonces, porque no había un registro, se actualizó, luego registro, sí, pero estamos hablando de grupos de hogares, pues, que son siempre, a ver, entre mínimamente 10 personas, ¿no? 12 personas. Entonces, 300 soles, 400 soles es una ayuda, pero no es, y para un mes es bastante difícil. Entonces había una desesperación en la cuarentena por salir. Mucha gente decía, prefiero morir con la pandemia, pero no morirme de hambre, ¿no? Entonces, y las mujeres pues que venían en un trabajo informal donde trabajaban el día a día y ganaban el día a día, ¿no? Entonces, las jefas de hogar, bueno, ellas al no salir no hay otro ingreso, ¿no? A veces tienen hijos pequeños, o en el tema de las que estaban conformadas y tenían conflictos con los maridos, se quedaron también solas y fueron a aumentar las filas de las jefas de hogar, ¿no? Entonces nosotros tratamos de dar virtualmente capacitaciones para levantar, afirmarla, trabajar todo el tema de empoderamiento, y eso, con todo el dolor, porque hay un dolor de pérdida de familiares, un dolor, un miedo a la inseguridad, pero también habíamos que entrar a trabajar, eso era importante, ¿no? Y cómo mejorar, tratar la relación de convivencia interna que es tan difícil, ¿no? Con el marido, con los hijos, y bueno, en el caso de violencia, imagínense, ¿no? Algunos apoyos pudimos dar, pero la mayoría era pues que no atendían las comisarías, no había el servicio, ¿no? Eso era muy duro para ellas, ¿no? Entonces, a través de la virtualidad que pusimos nosotros, por lo menos los talleres ayudaban a que ellas se sientan un poco mejor, tenían 3 veces por semana las capacitaciones, y eso fue ayudando bastante también en asumir y enfrentar la pandemia, el apoyar con los kits, ¿no? Los artículos de limpieza, mascarilla, detergente, desinfectante, bidones de agua también, y la canasta alimentaria que dábamos también productos básicos, eso, ¿no? Y para complementarlo con lo de huertos. Entonces, eso fue bastante realmente de ayuda. No somos Estado, es pequeña, pero es algo lo que se puede hacer. Y interesante también es que, sobre todo, llevábamos también tanquetas de agua, tanquetes le llamamos porque son, eh, como se dice, camiones muy grandes que llevan agua, sobre todo para la parte más alta de la zona de Manchay, Pachacamal, Lurín, ¿no? Y también en Villa, porque hay gente de muy, muy escasos que ni agua tenía. Entonces, lavado de manos, el tomar agua, o sea, a ver, si no hay agua ni para cocinar, ¿no? Entonces, tratar de ayudar ahí lo que se pudo, y también nos pusimos en coordinación a hacer alianzas con la iglesia, con otras ONGs, y tratar de hacer el gran apoyo, ¿no? De poder tratar de extender lo máximo posible. Y ahí también, bueno, actualmente seguimos dando apoyo a las mujeres en el tema emocional, psíquico y también físico, porque ellas están haciendo, ya están abriéndose algunos consultorios que tenemos en las zonas comunales para atender la parte física, por ejemplo, diabetes, todo el tema de hipertensión, dolores musculares que tienen, artritis, ¿no? Entonces, asma, ¿no? Entonces, esas cosas las atienden haciendo pues las terapias de, a ver, reflexología, de moxibustión, acupuntura, ¿no? Entonces, eso ayuda también muchísimo, ¿no? Pero bueno, la crisis también del desempleo, que hasta ahorita, por ejemplo, si bien es cierto, se está recuperando el país, y bueno, el tema político que tenemos, ¿no? De 100 días recién de Castillo, pero Castillo, ¿qué pasa, no? Por un lado, porque muchas de las mujeres que nosotros trabajamos son de provincia. Entonces se sienten muy identificadas con la familia, con él, que están hablando con uno de ellos, pero también por el otro lado ellas a veces sienten que, por ejemplo, en el tema, ¿no?, de los derechos de las mujeres no está siendo muy ahí claro, incisivo, ¿no? No que nadie quiere perder los derechos, ¿no? Pero sí sienten que hay que apoyarlo más, hay que ver más, ¿no? Estoy hablando de las mujeres en general y algunas líderes, ¿no? Otras que están más avanzadas, bueno, sienten que es cierto, hay mucho más antifujimorismo, ¿no? En las zonas más populares, y por lo tanto ha habido más apoyo, ¿no? Sin embargo, Lima pues tampoco es el Perú, ¿no? Son las provincias, y yo he tenido posibilidad de salir fuera del país y entonces estar en algunos sitios de la sierra, en el mismo Cajamarca, y el apoyo a él fuera realmente en el sur de Lima, que es Arequipa, Moquegua y Tacna, hay bastante apoyo porque lo sienten suyo, porque lo sienten que no lo dejan gobernar y que lo único que hacen es ponerle cabe, ¿no? Y obstáculos. Entonces, y sin embargo, acá en Lima sí sientes que la mayoría, está con el tema de que todo lo que hace mal. Y, por ejemplo, la propuesta que han hecho de Castillo de presentar varias cosas, y ahí está el tema de género, porque ha ayudado Verónica, la misma Mirta, ¿no?, a que realmente cambien el concepto, porque con Bellido era terrible, la xenofobia y el machismo se veía, y decíamos, eso no puede ser Castillo, ¿no? Entonces a él le faltaba más entrar en el plano, en conversaciones, ¿no?, sobre el tema realmente de ese enfoque de género, ¿no? Que muchos profesores además también lo tienen como un cupo, ¿no? Entonces hay que trabajar mucho eso. Las mujeres también sienten esa necesidad de qué cosas les están vendiendo y le dicen que es el género, que van a volver a sus hijos, ¿no?, gays, y, ¿no?, y sin embargo, estamos hablando de los derechos, ¿no? Hay que entrar ahí. Nosotros trabajamos mucho ese tema paralelo a todo esto. Mira, ahí está metido el tema del enfoque de género, porque hay que entender qué cosa es trabajar también la perspectiva, ¿no? Y bueno, la necesidad, por último, que nosotros recogemos en esto es que necesitamos brindar mayor servicios, especialmente a las jefas de hogares, a las organizaciones que han quedado muy golpeadas, a las promotoras locales, a las microempresarias, ¿no? Hay que apoyar en el tema de emprendimientos, eso es un papel muy importante y decisivo, sobre todo a todas las que han sido víctimas de violencia de género, y que creo que hay también todo un tema muy fuerte que en otro momento lo quisiera hablar, que es el tema de la trata, ¿no? Eso es también muy fuerte en selva, y es una cosa que, y las chicas también acá, ¿no?, en los conos, ¿no? Entonces es toda una problemática muy fuerte, ¿no? La trata, pero también el tema de la venta de órganos, ¿no? Es otra de las cosas que está creciendo. Entonces creo al menos cumplir con darles a conocer esta experiencia muy local, pero muy interesante, porque también es la forma de cómo se puede llegar y atender, y que el Estado también mire, ¿no? Estamos con un evento que se va a realizar, y en donde desde el Ministerio de la Mujer y el Ministerio de Salud quieren recoger las experiencias un poco que las ONG han venido enfrentando en la pandemia, y hasta ahora, bueno, hasta esta fecha del 2021, ¿no? Entonces creo que va a ser también muy rico alimentar eso, cruzar información, porque también los registros se quedaron de lado, ¿no? Entonces hay mucha cosa que registrar, ¿ok? Muchísimas gracias. Espero en poco tiempo haberles brindado, ¿no?, una mirada de lo que es el día a día, ¿no?, de las mujeres, y de cómo se ha tenido que enfrentar esta situación que ha sido muy dura y que nos deja mucho dolor, pero también nos abre que hay un día más, una puerta abierta para mirar, para no quebrarnos y para seguir avanzando en la lucha de las mujeres, y que juntas, ¿no?, hay que ayudarnos, ¿no?, en este tema, ¿no? Desde la política, porque hay que implementar cosas de políticas, ¿no? Y bueno, en el día a día también, ¿no? Son dos cosas que tienen que ir de la mano. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Se me fue Margaret.
No, no, estoy aquí, estoy mirando a las preguntas.
Ah, ok.
Gracias a Marta.
Ah, gracias.
Sí, vámonos a empezar con una pregunta de Anik Benavides, who asks, why did Castillo return recently to the position that camisea should be nationalized? That we, both Cynthia and Jo Marie might want to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it, so maybe I'll take a first crack at it. I mean, the quick answer is, I don't know. Perhaps it is, I mean, I think access to inexpensive gas is something that for everyday Peruvians is a real issue. And it seems like there's a little bit of confusion there about camisea gas, which is not necessarily the same as the distribution of household gas. This is one explanation I've read. But it could also be a nod to the more radical faction of Peru Libre, an attempt to kind of bring those warring factions that I was talking about together. But the flip-flopping, I mean, it's difficult to explain beyond that. I don't have any other insights than that. Maybe Cynthia or Marta have another thought about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I do know either. I think your point that Castillo has consistently sent mixed messages, right? There's a great deal of improvisation. I'd probably add there's a level of sort of lack of knowledge on a lot of these issues. I mean, this is somebody who was a school teacher and a teacher's right. So I would say on the plus side, but I think it's also helpful maybe to understand the mixed messages that he sends and the improvisation. Everybody that I've spoken with who's met with him says he's a nice guy. And I think that is one of the reasons why he was elected, but it also means that he's sort of trying to accommodate people. And it adds to this lack of decisiveness because he is trying to be nice to people. He might also be using it as kind of a negotiation. I mean, clearly there was a question there about his policies, and clearly they do need to negotiate more advantageous agreements with all kinds of companies, and so okay, you make this kind of comment, threat, and maybe it helps you in your negotiations. Maybe not, because they leave.
Hay una pregunta para las tres. ¿Qué tipo de programas podemos esperar de Castillo en el futuro cercano? Hay ustedes tienen algunas ideas a dónde va el gobierno en los próximos 100 días. Empezamos con Marta.
Ok, yo creo que Castillo, en realidad, un programa especialmente dirigido a las mujeres, creo que no está todavía en eso. Mirta puede ayudar mucho, pero creo que sí hay un tema que él está claro en sacar adelante el tema de, hacer cambios más en el tema de educación, ¿no? El ministerio también de todo lo que es la informática, ojalá, porque eso tiene que ver con educación, mejorar los niveles de educación. Yo espero eso, esperamos eso, que haya siquiera algunos cambios, algunas políticas importantes. De otro lado, también tratar de que realmente se promueva más apoyo a las microempresas de mujeres y y mejorar el nivel precario del empleo de mujeres, ¿no? Creo que esas dos cosas, por lo menos nosotros empleamos, y mejorar los niveles de, por ejemplo, el de salud de atención, ¿no? En salud reproductiva en gestantes a los niños también y niñas, ¿no? El tema de la desnutrición y el tema de salud mental es clave. Yo creo que si queremos avanzar en algo, hay que meterle mano después o paralelo a todo lo que es vacunación, es el tema de la salud mental y eso tiene que ver también con un tema de trabajar, pues justamente el tema de violencia, ¿no? Los niveles de violencia tiene que tratar el Ministerio de Mujer de bajar los índices y dar más atención y poner más énfasis, ¿no?
Cynthia?
Yeah, I think it was Marta emphasizing Mirta Vasquez's emphasis on the social services, and I think he will do that, and I think there's also a desire. Marta mentioned the bonos. There's a desire to get money into people's pocketbooks soon. Increase salaries in hospitals, for example. Many of these government workers, there can be no salary increases. And again, that's sort of one of the benefits of the strong economy and the strong minerals prices, that there are good taxes, and that it's possible to do those kinds of things. I think Joe Marie referred to kind of the big tension here is that Castillo, of course, did make some very big promises, especially as Joe Marie emphasized, the new constitution, and yet that would take a lot of work, and clearly they would like to have that happen, but it also is something that could scare the Congress. So it's a very delicate theme. I think in the next month or two, in any case, the emphasis will be on sort of trying to get the immediate kind of support services that Marta mentioned out to folks, given the current tolls of the pandemic.
Jo Marie?
Yeah, so one big thing that the Castillo government just recently announced is this second agrarian reform.
Yeah.
As we all know, the first agrarian reform in Peru took place towards the end of the 1960s under the government of General Juan Velasco. And it's considered, I think, the second most comprehensive land reform after the one in Cuba. Essentially eliminating the landowning class and turning over large land holdings to either state-run cooperatives or small peasant communities. This agrarian reform, according to what I've read about it, there will be no expropriations, so the elites don't get nervous. But there's an effort to invest, state-sponsored investment in promoting the agricultural sector, which makes a lot of sense because this is a man, first of all, he himself is from rural Peru. He identifies as a campesino, right? And I think, reaching out to his constituency, this is a very good way for him to do that by promoting food security, cooperatives, credits, and other support to the agricultural sector, which, for decades has been abandoned in Peru. So that's something, I'm not an expert on this at all, but it struck me as a very interesting, it's one of the big, in fact, I think it's probably only big policy initiative that I've seen come out of the administration to date that I think is worth note. And I think the other thing to what I mentioned in my presentation, which is the focus that, and Martha and Cynthia both mentioned here, is the sort of bread and butter issues that Mirta Vasquez emphasized in her presentation to Congress yesterday. Dealing with COVID and just the devastating failure of the health system to be able to be in a position to deal with the pandemic. Education, which is, Peru, despite all those years of economic growth that Cynthia talked about in the 2000s up until just recently, Peru's Peru's educational system is ranked one of the worst in all of Latin America. So there's a design, again, Castillo is a teacher, so it makes a lot of sense for him to emphasize, I think, reforms in education and jobs and economy. So I think those bread and butter issues are going to be the big focus. The other big question is, what about the Constituent Assembly, right? That he's talked about, that he promised would, you know, be convened separately from the existing Congress, would not replace the existing Congress, would respect, you know, the rules of the game, you know, write up a new constitution, submit it to a referendum, get people to vote in favor or against, sort of like what's happening in neighboring Chile. But, you know, Mirta Vázquez said, we're not really focusing on that right now. And this is obviously a source of tension within the Castillo administration. So whether, you know, I mean, I think that Peru's 1993 constitution should be replaced. I truly do. But I don't see there being a strong social push towards that end the way we saw in Chile in 2019 that led to the current Constituent Assembly there. I would like to see that, but I don't see kind of the social impetus for that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Question for Cynthia. Was there any involvement by international drug cartels in attempting to influence the elections?
Not to my knowledge. It's interesting. Obviously, there's a great deal of coca production in Peru and a great deal of drug trafficking. But you know, Jo Marie was highlighting the fragmentation of the political parties. Drug cartels are pretty fragmented in Peru too. It's an endemic problem, and so there's a lot of co-optation and drug money that goes especially into local campaigns, and I think quite a bit of drug money has gone into presidential campaigns too, but it's not kind of one international drug cartel that is managing this. And the policy on continuing the new Interior Minister is controversial, and it's in part because of his position on drug trafficking. And there were some allegations that he was close to drug traffickers, but all of this, like Jo Marie was saying, there's an awful lot of this throwing these allegations around without any foundation. And it does. I don't personally, like Jo Marie talking about the Constitution. Personally, I would like to see changes in Peru's drug policy, but that has not been at the forefront of the administration. I think it's sort of working around the edges to try to make it a little bit more family friendly, a little bit less draconian, but I don't see the basics really changing, or drug cartels believing that it's going to change a lot.
Thank you, Cynthia. Una pregunta para las tres. ¿Cuáles son las posibilidades que el gobierno va a crear un programa para responder a COVID que va a llegar a tener un nivel de éxito que es suficiente para disminuir el crisis de salud pública actual? Empezamos con Marta.
Ok, bueno, lo que está tratando de hacer el gobierno es avanzar lo que más se pueda con la vacunación, porque recién estamos en un 25-30%, ¿no? Todavía nos falta mucho trabajar ese tema, ¿no? Pero sin embargo se está avanzando, hay que decir, se está avanzando, están haciendo lo mejor, ¿sí? Creo que comenzar a hacer la atención primaria, tienen que comenzar a mover, porque es lo más importante, así también descentralizas, ¿no? Todo el tema, la atención primaria, entonces ya no tienen que llegar al hospital, ya es mejor atender y de inmediato, ¿no? Que esos centros de atención primaria sean de lo más eficientes, ¿no? Para poder contribuir en el tema del COVID. Y de otro lado, yo sí creo que hay que tener, el COVID tiene que tener un programa paralelo de la vacunación a un tema de salud mental. Mucho fallecido, mucha desolación, mucha muerte, mucha desesperación por alimentos, ¿no? La gente no le importaba, se juntaban, se subían al micro. Es que si tú no trabajas, el día no comes, ¿no? Entonces esa es una realidad. Y para ganar, ¿qué? Siquiera 10 soles, 20 soles, que estamos hablando de 3, 4 dólares. Entonces es una situación bastante dura y fuerte, ¿no? Casos donde por salir a trabajar han traído el virus y se han muerto 2 o 3, ¿no? Entonces, y conozco montones de casos. Acá la gente se caía y se moría. O sea, es eso. Y también se morían porque el tema a veces es el hambre, la TBC y todos los problemas que hay, ¿no? Entonces, eso es muy duro. Yo creo que tiene que haber un programa en salud mental, un programa del propio COVID, de darle la atención más rápida, que creo que empieza por los centros de atención primaria, y así se actúa más rápido, y de otro lado también la ayuda tiene que todavía seguir avanzando en la ayuda de los bonos, en la ayuda de alimentos, en la ayuda a que se refloten también microempresas. En ese sentido les decía, generar, apoyar a la microempresa, a la señora que está vendiendo sus sándwiches. Eso es lo que tenemos que hacer para mover, ¿no? Todo el motor, todo el tema de economía, y empezar por las que más les hace falta y las que más necesitan. Entonces creo que ahí vamos a poder comenzar a entender también cómo estamos tratando, porque eso da de una u otra manera, el generarte un ingreso te da seguridad mental y física, ¿no? Entonces creo que por ahí yo podría aportar que serían esas 3 cosas, ¿no?
Joe Marie?
I don't really have that much to add. I mean, I think that the interim Sagasti government really did a good job of helping Peru turn a corner, and that Castillo smartly continued that model. But so much more still needs to be done, right? The Peru's doing a very good job of getting people vaccinated. But as Martha's pointing out, there's still so much poverty and so much, such weak access to the health system that larger structural changes need to happen. I mean, my sister-in-law got COVID a few months ago, having had her first shot because she's a nurse. And my niece was like, I am not bringing her to the hospital where she's assigned because she will die there. I mean, that's the level of desperation that people are feeling in the current context because of just the lack of access for average people to the healthcare that they need in this context. It's very dramatic. I mean, as it is in so many places.
Yeah. Cynthia?
Yeah, I agree with what Marta and Joe Marie have said. I think, what I would add briefly is that, like the health workers in Peru were vaccinated with Sinopharm. They were that was the first to arrive. And so whether, that's as effective, and I've worried and wondered, I'm not a scientist, I don't know this, but a lot of young people in Peru have been affected too. I've wondered if it's a more virulent kind of variant that has taken such a horrible toll in Peru, and whether that could mean that there'll be even more need for vaccines. I mean, we're realizing here in the US, the need for boosters, and it just like Joe Marie said, people here too getting sick, even though they've had the vaccine. So, it's crucial that there be a lot of emphasis on continuing and advancing the vaccination campaign, and also, greater access to quality public health. It's absolutely priority number one, I think.
Thank you. On behalf of the Cuba program and the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, I want to thank our 3 panelists, Marta Pro Santana, Joe Marie Burt, and Cynthia Mcclintock, for a very incisive presentation concerning the current situation in Peru. We look forward to hearing more from you all. And thank you to Ellen Johnson and Gretchen Sanchez, who's not here tonight, for keeping us on the mark in terms of technology, etc. So thank you to everyone, including the audience.